The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune in the 42nd floor boardroom as leather portfolios clicked shut around the marble table. $5.2 billion, the largest environmental deal in Meridian Corp's history, waited for Helena Cross's signature. Then a voice cut through the corporate cologne and ambition like a blade through silk. That signature will destroy more lives than you'll ever save. Every head turned toward the doorway, where a man in a faded gray uniform stood perfectly still, a manila envelope clutched in weathered hands. The cleaning cart behind him seemed to fade into irrelevance as something dangerous flickered in his quiet eyes. Helena's pen hovered frozen above the contract. In 30 years of boardroom warfare, she'd never seen her executives look quite this stunned. The janitor took one step forward, and the room held its breath. "What happens next," he said softly, "depends on whether you're willing to listen to someone you've never bothered to see." 6 months earlier, Kevin Rivera had been a different man entirely. The alarm clock's shrill cry cut through the darkness of his cramped apartment at 4:30 in the morning, the same time it had every day for the past 3 years. His daughter Isabella's breathing was soft and steady from the next room, her 8-year-old dreams undisturbed by the harsh realities that kept her father awake most nights. Kevin's hands, already rough from endless nights of scrubbing floors and emptying trash bins, fumbled for his uniform in the darkness. The grey fabric felt heavier each morning, weighted down by dreams deferred and bills that never seemed to shrink. The refrigerator hummed with the sound of near-empty shelves, and Kevin made a mental note to stretch the groceries until Friday's paycheck. Isabella's school shoes were developing holes that duct tape could no longer hide, and her winter coat from last year barely covered her wrists anymore. These were the calculations that filled Kevin's mind as he prepared for another night shift at Meridian Corp, the gleaming tower where he was invisible by design and necessity. The building's top floors housed decisions that moved billions of dollars, while Kevin worked in the shadows, ensuring those decision-makers never had to see the consequences of choosing profit over people. His ex-wife Sarah had taken their son when she remarried, claiming Kevin's downward spiral after losing his engineering job made him an unfit father. The custody battle had drained his savings and his spirit, leaving him with weekend visits that felt more like supervised interviews. Isabella had chosen to stay with him, her fierce loyalty both a blessing and a burden that kept him moving forward when everything else felt impossible. She was the reason he swallowed his pride each night, put on that grey uniform, and cleaned the offices of people who made more in a day than he earned in a year. The Meridian building stood like a monument to everything Kevin had once aspired to be. He'd graduated summa cum laude from MIT with a degree in environmental engineering, had worked for firms that consulted on major infrastructure projects, had once believed his expertise could help build a better world. Now he mopped the floors where those conversations happened without him, invisible to the very people who could have benefited from his knowledge. The irony wasn't lost on him that he cleaned the offices of the environmental division, emptying trash cans filled with reports and proposals he could have written in his sleep. But invisibility, Kevin had learned, came with unexpected advantages. People said things around janitors they would never say around colleagues. They left sensitive documents on desks, assuming the cleaning staff couldn't read or wouldn't care. They conducted phone calls in empty conference rooms, not realizing that sound carried through the building's ventilation system to the utility closets where Kevin stored his supplies. Over the months, he'd begun to piece together a picture that made his engineer's mind recoil in horror. Meridian Corp's latest environmental deal wasn't the green initiative their public relations team claimed it to be. The $5.2 billion contract would fund a series of waste processing facilities in low-income communities, facilities that would generate massive profits while poisoning the air and water of people who had no voice in the decision. Kevin had seen the real environmental impact reports, the ones marked internal use only, that found their way into trash cans after executives decided the risks were acceptable. He'd overheard phone calls where community health concerns were dismissed as manageable externalities, and where lobbying efforts to silence opposition were discussed like military strategies. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night in November when Kevin found a shredded document in Helena Cross's personal wastebasket. The paper had been cut by an industrial shredder, but Kevin's engineering mind saw patterns where others saw chaos. He spent his lunch breaks that week carefully reconstructing the document, piece by tiny piece, using techniques he'd learned in graduate school for analyzing fragmented data. What emerged was a memo from Meridian's own environmental scientists, buried and destroyed because it contradicted the official narrative. The memo detailed how the proposed facilities would release toxins that exceeded EPA safety limits by 300%. It outlined how the company's internal studies showed increased cancer rates in communities near similar facilities, information that had been deliberately excluded from the environmental impact statements submitted to regulators. Most damning of all, it revealed that Helena Cross had personally authorized payments to local officials to fast-track approvals without proper community input. The memo's conclusion was stark. The project would generate massive profits for shareholders while creating what one scientist called sacrifice zones in poor neighborhoods. That night, Kevin sat at his kitchen table with the reconstructed document spread before him, Isabella asleep in the next room. His hands shook as he read the cold calculations that reduced human lives to acceptable losses on a balance sheet. He thought about his own neighborhood, about Isabella's friends at school, about all the communities across the country that would bear the cost of Meridian's profits. The weight of what he knew pressed down on him like a physical force, and for the first time in months, Kevin felt the spark of his old self beginning to flicker back to life. He spent the following weeks gathering more evidence, using his access to piece together a comprehensive picture of Meridian's deception. Security cameras didn't track janitors closely, and Kevin's routes through the building gave him access to offices and conference rooms where crucial conversations took place. He learned to listen without appearing to memorize details that could be verified later, to become a ghost who saw everything and remembered it all. The manila envelope grew thicker with each passing day, filled with proof that could derail the largest environmental deal in corporate history. The morning of the signing ceremony, Kevin stood in his apartment bathroom, staring at his reflection in the cracked mirror. The man looking back at him still wore the grey uniform, still carried the calluses and exhaustion of 3 years spent being invisible. But something had changed in his eyes, a resolution that reminded him of the engineer he used to be, the father he was determined to become. Isabella knocked on the door, asking if he would be home for dinner, and Kevin's voice was steady when he promised her he would be. As he walked through the building's pristine lobbies toward the service elevator, Kevin felt the weight of the manila envelope in his hands. Security guards nodded at him with the casual dismissal reserved for the help. Executives stepped aside without making eye contact, and the business of the building continued around him as if he were a piece of furniture. But today, Kevin's invisibility would become his greatest weapon. Today, The man no one bothered to see would speak with a voice that couldn't be ignored. The boardroom on the 42nd floor buzzed with anticipation as Helena Cross prepared to sign the deal that would cement her legacy as an environmental leader. The assembled executives and board members represented billions in assets and decades of corporate experience, but none of them noticed the janitor who had been quietly present for months, watching and learning and waiting for exactly this moment. The contract lay open on the marble table, its crisp pages representing the culmination of years of planning and positioning. Helena's pen moved toward the signature line with the confidence of someone who had never doubted their right to shape the world according to their vision. The assembled crowd leaned forward slightly, anticipating the historic moment when $5.2 billion would flow toward projects that promised to revolutionize environmental management. The camera crews positioned around the room prepared to capture the moment for the press release that would dominate tomorrow's business headlines. But Kevin Rivera had other plans. The invisible man who cleaned their offices and emptied their trash cans stepped forward from the shadows, and the careful choreography of corporate power was about to face its greatest disruption. The manila envelope in his hands contained more than evidence. It held the power to expose the ugly truth behind Meridian's environmental facade, and to demand accountability from people who had never been challenged by someone they considered beneath their notice. Helena's pen stopped moving as Kevin's voice cut through the celebration, and for the first time in 3 years, the man in the gray uniform was no longer invisible. The room fell silent. Every face turned toward him, and Kevin felt the full weight of the moment settling around him like armor. Everything he had lost, everything he had endured, everything he hoped to reclaim for his daughter's future came down to the next few minutes in that boardroom. The security guards reached for their radios, but Helena raised a hand to stop them. Something in Kevin's stance, in the quiet authority of his voice, had penetrated the corporate bubble that usually insulated her from inconvenient truths. Her executives shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to handle a situation their business school educations had never prepared them for. The man they had seen but never noticed now commanded the room with the kind of presence that couldn't be bought or manufactured. Kevin opened the manila envelope with deliberate care, his movements precise and confident. The shredded memo, painstakingly reconstructed, lay on top of the other documents like an accusation made tangible. Below it were photographs of contaminated water supplies near existing Meridian facilities, medical reports showing elevated cancer rates in affected communities, and correspondence that revealed the company's knowledge of these consequences. The evidence was damning, comprehensive, and impossible to dismiss as the ravings of a disgruntled employee. "I've been cleaning your offices for 3 years," Kevin said, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated knowledge and suppressed expertise. "You throw away a lot of interesting reading material, Miss Cross, especially the reports you don't want the public to see." He held up the reconstructed memo, and Helena's face went pale as she recognized the document she had personally ordered destroyed. "Did you really think shredding the truth would make it disappear?" The boardroom erupted in whispered conversations as executives tried to gauge the severity of the situation. Legal counsel huddled with PR representatives, their faces grim with the recognition that their carefully constructed narrative was crumbling in real time. The camera crews continued filming, unsure whether they were witnessing a publicity stunt or a corporate crisis, but sensing that either way, they were capturing something significant. Helena Cross had built her career on controlling narratives and managing perceptions, but Kevin Rivera represented something she had never encountered: consequences delivered by someone with nothing left to lose. His calm demeanor and methodical presentation of evidence spoke to a level of preparation that belied his humble uniform. This wasn't the desperate act of a mentally unstable employee. It was the calculated exposure of corporate malfeasance by someone who understood exactly what he was revealing. "You're making a mistake," Helena said, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around her. "This is a private meeting, and you're trespassing. Security will escort you out, and we'll pretend this unfortunate incident never happened." She reached for her phone, but Kevin's next words stopped her cold. "My name is Kevin Rivera," he said, and something in his tone made the room fall silent again. "I'm not just a janitor, Ms. Cross. I'm a licensed environmental engineer with 15 years of experience in waste management and contamination assessment. I've read every document you've tried to hide, and I understand the implications better than anyone in this room." The transformation was remarkable. The invisible man in the grey uniform suddenly commanded the space with the authority of expertise and moral conviction. The silence that followed was deafening. Helena's executives exchanged glances that conveyed years of corporate communication in seconds. Damage control, legal liability, public relations nightmare. The carefully orchestrated signing ceremony had become a trial, with Kevin Rivera serving as prosecutor, witness, and evidence all at once. The $5.2 billion deal hung in the balance, its future suddenly uncertain in the face of inconvenient truths. Kevin continued his presentation with the methodical precision of an engineer laying out a case study. Each document built upon the previous one, creating an inescapable narrative of corporate negligence and deliberate harm. He explained how the proposed facilities would concentrate toxic waste in communities already struggling with environmental injustice, how the company's own scientists had warned against the health risks, and how those warnings had been systematically suppressed to protect profit margins. "These aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet," Kevin said, holding up photographs of children playing near contaminated water sources. "These are real people in real communities who will suffer real consequences from your decisions. My daughter goes to school with kids who could be affected by facilities like these. I clean the offices where you plan their destruction, and I can't stay silent anymore." The emotional weight of his words hit the room like a physical force. Several board members shifted uncomfortably, their own grandchildren's faces flashing through their minds as Kevin's presentation continued. The abstract concept of acceptable risk became personal when delivered by someone who lived with the consequences of such decisions every day. Corporate responsibility suddenly felt less like a public relations strategy and more like a moral imperative. Helena found herself facing a choice she had never anticipated. Her entire career had been built on the assumption that power insulated her from accountability, that wealth created barriers between decision-makers and consequences. But Kevin Rivera had shattered those barriers with nothing more than truth and the courage to speak it. The man she had never bothered to notice had become the most important person in the room. The cameras continued rolling as Helena stared at the contract awaiting her signature. The pen in her hand felt impossibly heavy, weighted down by the knowledge that Kevin had forced her to confront. Around the table, her executives and board members waited for her decision, their faces reflecting the corporate calculation that typically drove such moments. But something had changed in the dynamics of the room, a shift in power that money couldn't purchase or influence, couldn't control. Kevin stood quietly, his presentation complete, allowing the weight of truth to do what force never could. His transformation from invisible janitor to credible whistleblower was complete, but more importantly, he had reminded everyone present that dignity and expertise weren't commodities that could be bought or sold. The grey uniform still marked him as part of the service class, but his knowledge and moral authority elevated him above the corporate hierarchy that had tried to render him invisible. "What do you want?" Helena asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. It was a question that acknowledged Kevin's power in the situation, a recognition that he held something more valuable than money or influence: the truth, and the courage to speak it publicly. Kevin's answer was simple and devastating in its clarity. "I want you to read the real environmental impact reports to the communities that will be affected. I want you to hold public hearings where people can ask questions based on actual data, not corporate spin. And I want you to look your shareholders in the eye and tell them that profits don't justify poisoning children." His demands weren't revolutionary. They were simply requests for basic honesty and accountability. The room fell silent as the implications of Kevin's words sank in. What he was asking for would likely kill the deal, or at minimum, reduce its profitability to levels that might not justify the investment. But his moral authority made refusal seem not just heartless, but impossible to defend publicly. The cameras were still rolling, and everyone in the room understood that their response to Kevin's challenge would define not just this moment, but their legacies. Helena looked around the table at faces that reflected decades of corporate experience and billions in assets. Then back at Kevin Rivera, the janitor who had somehow become the most powerful person in the room. The contrast was stark. On one side, institutional power built on hierarchy and wealth. On the other, moral authority grounded in truth and human dignity. The choice between them would determine not just the fate of the $5.2 billion deal, but the kind of leader Helena Cross would choose to be. The pen trembled in Helena's hand as she faced the decision that would define the rest of her career. Around her, the assembled executives and board members represented everything she had worked to achieve: wealth, influence, respect within the corporate community. But Kevin Rivera represented something she had lost along the way: the ability to sleep peacefully, knowing her decisions wouldn't harm innocent people. Minutes passed in silence as Helena weighed her options. She could dismiss Kevin's concerns, have security escort him out, and proceed with the signing as planned. Her lawyers would handle any legal challenges, her PR team would manage the narrative, and the deal would proceed as planned. The corporate machine was designed to handle exactly these kinds of disruptions, and her career would continue its upward trajectory. But Kevin's presence had changed something fundamental in the equation. His expertise couldn't be dismissed as the ranting of a disgruntled employee, and his evidence couldn't be explained away as misunderstanding or manipulation. More importantly, his moral authority had exposed the hollow nature of her own justifications. The communities that would be affected by her decision were no longer abstract concepts. They were neighborhoods where people like Kevin raised children like Isabella. Helena set down her pen and looked directly at Kevin for the first time since he had entered the room. "You're right," she said, her voice carrying across the silent boardroom with surprising strength. "This deal, as currently structured, would cause harm that can't be justified by the profits it would generate. I won't sign it today, and I won't sign it until we can guarantee that affected communities have been fully informed and genuinely consulted." The reaction was immediate and intense. Board members erupted in protests, legal counsel whispered urgently about contractual obligations, and PR representatives frantically calculated the cost of the decision. But Helena's choice had been made, and the power dynamics in the room shifted completely. Kevin Rivera, the invisible janitor, had accomplished what environmental groups, community activists, and regulatory agencies had failed to achieve. He had stopped one of the largest environmental deals in corporate history, with nothing more than truth and moral courage. As security finally moved to escort Kevin from the building, Helena stood and extended her hand. "Mr. Rivera," she said, "I'd like to schedule a meeting with you tomorrow. We need to discuss how Meridian Corp can do better, and it's clear that your expertise could help us find a path forward that serves both our shareholders and the communities we affect." Kevin shook her hand, his grip firm and confident, the handshake of equals rather than employer and employee. "I'll be there," he said simply. "But I'll be coming as Dr. Kevin Rivera, environmental engineer, not as your janitor." The transformation was complete. The invisible man had reclaimed not just his voice, but his identity and his purpose. 3 months later, Kevin Rivera sat in a conference room on the 40th floor of the Meridian building, reviewing environmental impact assessments for a revised version of the company's community development program. His new title, Director of Community Environmental Assessment, came with a salary that allowed him to move Isabella to a better school and replace her worn winter coat with one that actually fit. But more importantly, it came with the authority to ensure that environmental justice wasn't just a public relations strategy, but an operational reality. Helena Cross had proven that her commitment to change was genuine, restructuring Meridian's environmental division to prioritize community impact assessment and transparent public engagement. The revised program would cost significantly more than the original deal and generate lower profits, but it would also provide genuine environmental benefits without sacrificing vulnerable communities. The transformation hadn't been easy for the company, but it had been necessary. Isabella Rivera walked through her new school's hallways with pride, telling anyone who would listen that her father was helping to protect the environment and make sure companies treated people fairly. She didn't fully understand the corporate dynamics that had led to his transformation from janitor to executive, but she understood that her father had found a way to use his knowledge to help people, and that made her proud in ways that no amount of money could have achieved. The gray uniform that had marked Kevin's invisibility hung in his closet, a reminder of the 3 years he had spent learning that dignity wasn't determined by job title or salary, but by the courage to stand for what was right when it mattered most. He kept it not as a symbol of shame, but as a reminder that truth could emerge from the most unexpected places, and that moral authority belonged to anyone willing to claim it. Kevin's story became a case study in business schools, not as an example of corporate disruption, but as a demonstration of how authentic expertise and moral courage could transform institutional power. Students learned that the most important voices in any organization might be the ones that hierarchy renders invisible, and that true leadership sometimes came from those willing to risk everything to speak truth to power. On quiet evenings, when Isabella was asleep and the apartment was still, Kevin sometimes reflected on the moment when he had stepped out of invisibility and into his own power. The transformation hadn't been magic. It had been the result of preparation, courage, and the recognition that his expertise and moral authority mattered regardless of what uniform he wore. He had discovered that being truly seen required not just speaking truth, but being willing to stand behind that truth when everything was at stake. The manila envelope that had contained his evidence sat empty on his bookshelf, but its impact continued to ripple through Meridian Corp and the broader business community. Kevin's intervention had saved the health of countless communities, while proving that corporate accountability could be achieved through moral courage rather than legal battles or regulatory pressure. He had shown that sometimes the most powerful disruption came not from technology or market forces, but from the simple act of an invisible person refusing to remain silent. Years later, when business journalists wrote about the deal that never was, they would focus on the financial implications and the corporate strategy shifts that followed. But for Kevin Rivera, the real victory was smaller and more personal. It was watching Isabella grow up in a world where her father's work helped protect communities rather than exploit them, and knowing that he had reclaimed not just his career, but his integrity and his voice. The invisible man had become visible not by changing his circumstances, but by having the courage to speak truth when truth was desperately needed. The story of Kevin Rivera and Helena Cross became a reminder that transformation was possible at any level of any organization, and that moral authority could emerge from the most unexpected places. It proved that expertise and integrity weren't the exclusive domain of corner offices and executive suites, but belonged to anyone willing to use their knowledge and courage in service of justice. Most importantly, it showed that being truly seen required not just speaking truth, but having the courage to stand behind that truth when everything was at stake. In the end, the $5.2 billion deal that was never signed became more valuable than any contract could have been. It demonstrated that corporate power could be held accountable by moral courage, that invisible people could become visible through the simple act of refusing to be silent, and that sometimes the most important voice in the room belonged to the person everyone else had forgotten to notice. Kevin Rivera's journey from janitor to executive wasn't just a career change. It was a reminder that dignity, expertise, and moral authority couldn't be purchased or bestowed, but had to be claimed by those brave enough to speak truth when truth was needed most.